All right. Well, it is Thursday and windy and cold outside. So, what a better day than today to read a chapter in my book. I am going to begin reading. I'm sure you guys will be joining me in a moment. The last thing that we read about was that the German soldiers or the Nazis were run off, and the Soviets were coming in to save the Jewish people in the concentration camps. So I will begin. This chapter is the Hi Mom. This chapter is the last chapter until the epilogue. And the epilogue is kind of the ending here. So yes. Oh, hi, Noah. Right? Did I get it right? Anyway, as I was saying, that this book this is the last actual chapter of the book, and I'm going to begin reading it to you now. After the soldier left, the gates swung open. I was in shock. We all were. We had gone from years of imprisonment to freedom. I felt confused, weak, and ecstatic all at once. Disoriented and uncertain, we continued to drift around the Brunlitz camp for 2 days. I couldn't absorb the fact that we were now liberated, even as our enemies, the vanquished German soldiers, streamed past us by the hundreds. I stood and watched them, the once confident troops, now dejected prisoners of the Soviets. Hour after hour, they trudged by, their heads down, their expressions sullen. Some of the Jewish workers contemplated revenge. A few grabbed the soldiers' boots and tossed their own wooden clogs at them in exchange. I didn't join in. There was no way to even the score with the Nazis, no matter what I did. All I wanted was to remember those hours forever, remember the sight of the once proud soldiers straggling past us in defeat. Eventually, the Czech authorities provided free transport by trains for those of us who decided to return to Poland. Hi, Marin. Where was I at? Oh, my mother longed to go all the way to Narevka to find Herschel and her family, but my father said it was still too dangerous to travel that far east. Instead, he decided that the 5 of us would return to Krakow. Of course, we all nurtured the secret hope that somehow Salig had escaped and would be there waiting for us. This time, the cattle cars had bunks and the sliding doors remained open. We could breathe in the smells of springtime and watch the passing countryside. From my spot, I surveyed the scenery and noticed a few signs of the war that had decimated our lives. Trees sprouted new leaves. Wildflowers were blooming. The scars from the war, which I felt so deeply, weren't visible in the passing landscape. It was almost as if these terrible years of suffering had never happened. But I only had to look at the worn and weary faces of my parents to know otherwise. As the trains rumbled eastward, I allowed myself to do something I hadn't done in years, to think about the future. For the past 6 years, thinking about the future had only meant thinking about how to survive the next hour, to find the next scrap of food, how to escape the next brush of death. Now the future meant much more. I might be able to return to school. I might be able to have a home, adequate food, security. One day, I might feel safe again. The train stopped frequently to let passengers off at points near where they had come from. Each time, passengers climbed down and quickly left without looking back or saying goodbye. There was no reason to prolong the ordeal a moment longer. I watched my former coworkers scatter across Poland, one by one, family by family. All of us prayed that our suffering was over, that we could go back to our lives, to the families from whom we had been separated for so long. Sadly, in Krakow, I soon realized the suffering wasn't over. My parents, David, Paige, and I arrived still wearing our striped prison uniforms. We clutched our only possessions, the bolts of cloth and bottles of vodka that Schindler had secured us with. and walked tentatively through the city toward our old neighborhood. We were greeted by curious stares and an indifference that completely unsettled me. We found Wojek, the kind Gentile who'd sold my father's suits, and we connected with a former neighbor on Premslow Street. He let us stay in his apartment a few nights and decided to throw a little party for my father. Over shots of vodka from one of our precious bottles, he confessed he was surprised that we had survived. It became clear that many others in the city shared his surprise. To some, the Jews' unexpected return was not welcome. They wondered what we would expect from them. They had suffered their own hardships and losses during the war and weren't interested in ours. Some were anti-Semitic and had been pleased to see us out of what they considered to be their country, despite the fact that Jews had lived there for over 1,000 years. Now we were back, causing them anxiety, though we were simply trying to adjust to freedom and begin rebuilding our lives. My mother found a tailor who sewed a pair of pants for me from my bolt of cloth, my first new trousers in nearly 6 years. His payment was the fabric remaining on the bolt. My father was able to get his old job back at the glass factory. We urgently needed a place of our own. We found lodging in a student dormitory that had become a receiving center for refugees. That's what we were now, I realized. Refugees. Outsiders, ironically, in a country where Jews had a long history. At the end of the war, of Krakow's pre-Jewish population of about 60,000, only a few thousand remained. The dormitory housed other returning homeless as well. As in the ghetto, we divided the room into sections using ropes with blankets draped over them. Soon there were more and more people looking for a space as Jews returned to the city to search for their families and to try to reclaim their homes and their pre-war lives. Many of them came from Soviet-occupied areas in the East. One day, my mother found a young woman and her mother sleeping in the hallway. My mother insisted that they come share our space. Gradually, each of the four corners filled with a different family. That summer, the backlash in Krakow against returning Jews intensified. A Jewish woman was falsely accused of kidnapping a Gentile boy. Rumors circulated that emaciated Jews returning from the camps were using Gentiles' children's blood for transfusions, a revival of the ancient accusations known as blood libel. The accusation in the past and the present was false and ridiculous. Hi, Lucas. But nonetheless, it put the city on the edge. A mob gathered at one of the remaining synagogues, shouting slurs, and then came to our building to throw rocks at the windows. After an hour or so, the hoodlums left, but the violence revived our old fears. Once again, I longed to be invisible. My father went to work every day, while the rest of us spent most of our time inside our makeshift home, afraid to venture out. Was this to be our future? Had we survived the war, the ghetto, and the camps, only to continue to live in dread? On August 11th, 1945, rioting broke out when a Gentile boy claimed that Jews were trying to kill him. Hooligans attacked our building again, pelting the windows with rocks, pulling people from the first floor to beat them with their bare hands. We scrambled from our room to the safety of a higher floor. Elsewhere in the city, rioters looted a synagogue and burned the Torah scrolls. There were reports that Jews beaten in the streets had been hospitalized only to be beaten again. At the factory, my father had been warned not to leave after work. The streets were too dangerous, so he stayed overnight in relative safety. My mother, my siblings, and I faced a long night on our own. The next day, after my father returned from the factory, we told him what happened the night before. He remained silent. "We can't stay here," David said to my father. "If we could get back to Narevka," my mother offered. She often said this after the war. She had never felt at home in the city and certainly had no reason to alter that feeling now. But the real reason for her longing to return to Narevka was the thread of hope that at least some of our family, especially my oldest brother Herschel, had survived. "We can't go back yet," responded my father. "Maybe never." My father related his devastating news. My mother listened, horror-struck, as he told us what he had learned from his factory contacts originally in Narevka. Some had managed to go back to look for their family. What they reported was terrifying. Following the invading German army, mobile killing squads of the SS had swept through the villages of eastern Poland with the sole purpose of murdering Jews. They reached Narevka in August 1941. There, they took all the Jewish men in the village, some 500, to a meadow near the forest and machine gunned them down. The SS took the women and children to a nearby barn where they were held for a day, and then they too were executed. In one blow, all of our extended family in Narevka, some 100 relatives, my grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, have been murdered. It was beyond belief. As she thought of her parents, my mother could only whisper, "I hope they died before the SS arrived." All at once, the impact of what we had been told hit us. We had never heard from Herschel in those 6 long years we had been separated. We had assumed he made it to Narevka, which in 1939 was under Soviet control and had seemed a safer place for him than Krakow. Now we learned that Herschel had indeed made it back to Narevka, only to be taken prisoner and murdered by the SS assassins on the terrible day in August. My mother collapsed as the rest of us stood, stunned by the atrocity. Many years later, I went back to Narevka. A Gentile Pole I met there spoke of how one young Jew had tried to run, but as he said, one of ours, in other words, a non-Jew, spotted him and reported him to the SS, who shot him immediately. As I think about my impetuous brother, I can imagine him being that young man who made a run for the forest, doing everything he possibly could to try to survive. As the weeks passed, life did not improve. There were constant reports of recurring hostility towards Jews. Jobs were scarce and so was food. The future for us in Krakow looked bleak. Early in 1946, David and Pasha decided to plan to go back to Czechoslovakia to see if they could settle there. I went with them across the border. After a few days, however, my mother sent word through a friend that she needed at least one of her children to be with her. As the youngest, only 16, I was the obvious choice. I said goodbye to David and Pasha and went back to Krakow. She then returned to Czechoslovakia and David. It hurt to say goodbye to my brother and sister. Amazingly, we had managed to stay together during the last years of the war. Now they were adults and eager to begin anew. My parents never would have tried to dissuade them. A few months later, my parents enlisted the help of a Zionist organization, one of the groups whose goal was to establish a Jewish national state. We hoped that they could smuggle us out of Poland. We did not consider going to British-controlled Palestine, as the life there would be too arduous for my parents. After several weeks of anxiously awaiting, our window of opportunity came. We paid a guard a small bribe and slipped across the border. We traveled by train through Czechoslovakia, arriving in Salzburg, Austria. There, a United Nations relief organization assigned us to a displaced persons camp in Wetzlar, Germany, in the American occupation zone. On the one hand, it seemed strange to be in Germany, of all the places. On the other, it felt good to be opening a new chapter in our lives. Homeless, stateless, in yet another camp, we could have felt defeated. But Wetzlar, Germany was very different from the camps during the war. We had 3 meals a day, a reliable medical care, and the protection of the U.S. military. Pretty good. Most importantly, we could come and go as we pleased. I took every opportunity to go into town and strike up a conversation with anyone willing to talk with me. I befriended other teenagers in the camp, including a pretty Hungarian girl my age. I learned to speak fluent Hungarian just so I could talk with her. In fact, some Hungarians were so convinced that I was Hungarian, they spoke Polish when they didn't want me to understand what they were saying. Little did they know that Polish was my native language. To my mother's delight, I put on weight, began to fill out my skeletal frame, and grew several inches. My hair came back dark and thick. I had new clothes made by tailors in the camp who ripped apart military uniforms at the seams and refashioned them into civilian clothes. Someone even gave me a hat, a brown fedora. It became my trademark. I wore it everywhere, emulating it in my own way, my father's pre-war flair for style. Occasionally, my new friends and I would argue about who had it worse during the war. Oh, this sounds familiar, right? Like kids like, no, I had it worse. Oh, no, I have it worse, right? Even adults do that. Some had been in labor camps, some in concentration camps, some even in the infamous Auschwitz death camp. Others had been in hiding in many different circumstances. We couldn't resist the urge to swap stories and exchange information, even though such conversations sometimes led to jealousy and anger. In a strange way, we seemed to be vying for the worst experience. We all had been through our private hells, and we were still processing what we had experienced. None of us knew what to do with the enormous burden of our memories. Sometimes the pain of our grief would break through the surface and threaten the fragile friendships we were nurturing. I never felt like the camp was home, but I began to get used to the life there as we waited to see which country might allow us to immigrate. There were lots of people like us looking for a place that would take them in. The Germans had ended my schooling shortly after I turned 10. My parents were concerned about my lack of education and what that might mean for my future. My father began looking for someone to tutor me, to help me make up at least part of what I had lost. In the nearby town, he found a former German engineer who was now unemployed and had 5 children to feed. 3 times a week for 2 years, I went to Dr. New's house to be tutored in mathematics and drafting. We began with basic arithmetic and worked our way up the complexities of trigonometry. So I kind of had this relating to this as people are wondering what to do about school and what we're going to do about it, and what about all this learning that you're going to miss. And like, if we put things into perspective, Leon Layson missed 6 years of his life as a child. So he was your age, younger, probably your age, and then he came out of it a teenager. And so he missed all those years of school. So maybe, just maybe, I'm thinking as I'm reading this in a different light, knowing what we know now and experience what we're having experienced now, that, if any of you are worried about your education, please don't be worried about your education. You'll be just fine. You had me as your teacher, right? And you are you as a student. So don't worry about your education right now. Just try to continue reading, me, read, and continue in helping out at your house. And life does go on, and you will be okay. So I hope none of you are worried about your education. You will be just fine. Look at Leon, 6 years of not having any education. So if he can do it, we can probably also do it, I think, especially with all the horrible experiences that he had. We have none of, and we haven't experienced things like he had experienced. So over time, I came to look forward to my lessons with Dr. New. After my experiences with Oskar Schindler, I felt I could tell the difference between those Germans who had been true Nazis and those who had retained some humanity, even if they had joined the Nazi Party. I found that the true believers would look down at their shoes or wind their watches when someone mentioned the war. When someone spoke of what the Jews had gone through, their stock response was, "We didn't know." Dr. New wasn't like that. He asked me about my experiences and genuinely listened to what I told him. I was reminded of how Oskar Schindler had asked me questions and had waited for my answers. Dr. New didn't try to whitewash what had happened. One time when I was telling him a story, his wife overheard us. "We didn't know," she muttered. He gave her a piercing look and said, "Don't say that." After the awkward moment passed, he urged me to continue with my story. So it sounds like, most Jewish people, if they weren't part of the Nazis party, they were still like, "Oh, we just didn't know." Like, they wanted the Jewish people to think they didn't know, but in reality, those people knew what was happening. And his tutor, Dr. New, put his wife kind of in her place when she tried to mumble that, "Oh, we didn't know that this was happening." And he said, "Don't say that, we did know." Through Jewish organizations, my parents connected with our few relatives in the United States. My mother's sister Shayna and brother Morris, who had left Norefka in the early 1900s, now lived in Los Angeles. Uncle Carl had died shortly after arriving in the United States. Based on the reports they heard, they had come to believe that all their family in Poland had been murdered. They were ecstatic to learn that the three of us were in a displaced persons camp. Wait, what? No, I mean, they weren't happy that they were in a camp, but they were happy that they were alive. I thought that sentence always sounds funny to me. They were so happy that we were in a camp. They're just happy that they were alive. Our American relatives wrote letters and sent packages to us, packages filled with food donated by other friends from Norefka now living in the United States. Since we didn't have any money to pay Dr. New for my tutoring, we gave him items from our care packages, coffee and cigarettes, and food items from the DP camp my father would not eat, like canned ham. DP, displaced persons. Okay. In 1948, Pasha and David joined a Zionist group and left Czechoslovakia for the new state of Israel that had been founded that very year. When we received word of their plans, I wanted to go with them. By this time, my parents had decided we would go to the United States as soon as my aunt and uncle could make the arrangements. My parents reasoned that in America, we could find jobs and help support my sister and brother, whose lives would not be easy in a country struggling to establish itself. Although I was now almost 19 and longed to join my brother and sister, after all my parents had been through, I couldn't refuse their plea for me to stay with them. At last, in May 1949, after nearly 3 years in a displaced persons camp, we received word that our immigration request had been approved. Almost beyond belief, we were really going to the United States of America. We took the train to Germany and then traveled on Bremerhaven, Germany, and then traveled on a former troop ship for 9 days across the Atlantic Ocean to Boston, Massachusetts. I spent all the time I could on deck, watching the ocean stretch into all directions. Something about its majesty, its vastness, brought me a peace I had not known before. So this kind of reminds me in The Long Walk to Water, when he was coming to America from Africa. Different time frame, but kind of the same type of feeling. Like they couldn't believe that they were actually going to the United States, that they were going to be able to be free. We slept in hammocks below deck and battled seasickness, although I wasn't as badly affected as some. We refugee passengers represented many nations and spoke many languages. I was awed by how many of the languages I didn't know. What we didn't speak was English, so we had identification tags on our jackets to make sure we ended up in the right place. Uncle Morris's son, Dave Golner, who lived in Connecticut, found us as we were being processed by immigration after our ship docked at Boston Harbor. During the immigration procedures, our last name changed to Layson. I had already abandoned Labe for the much cooler, I thought, name Leon. Dave knew only a little Yiddish and no Polish, so he did more pointing than speaking as he directed us from the port to the train station. He gave us spending money for the 5-day trip to Los Angeles, California. It felt good to ride the train this time, to sit in a passenger car in a plush seat, not crammed in a cattle car. Probably some people would think our trip was an ordeal. We slept in our seats. There wasn't a shower for us to use. But for me, every minute of the trip was wonderful. I spent hours sitting by the window watching the world pass by as we went from the East Coast to Chicago, then across the Midwest and through the Southwest. Our lack of English made for some confusing moments along the way. For example, whenever we went to the dining car, all we could do was point to what someone else was eating or to a few incomprehensible words on the menu. Often we ended up with some very strange combinations. I had no idea how the prices on the menu correspond to the money in my pocket, so I would hand the waiter a large bill and wait to receive change. I gradually accumulated a larger and larger stack of coins. Back in my seat in the passenger car, I would study them and try to figure out what was worth what. I could imagine if you're like ordering off a menu and you can't read it, like what you ended up with. Like maybe you ended up with like 5 desserts. I don't know. Or like, I don't even know. That would be kind of funny. Of course, I could read the numbers on the coins, but that was not the same as understanding the values. One afternoon, a woman a few seats away observed me looking at the change I had just acquired from paying. Oh, sorry, change I had just acquired for paying for lunch. She left her seat and came over to sit next to me. She smiled and took a coin out of her hand. This is a nickel, she said. She pointed out another coin. This is a dime. And she continued, and this one's a penny. We went over the denominations a few times 1 cent, 5 cents, 10 cents, 25 cents. After I learned how to say the names and values, the woman smiled again and returned to her seat. She probably forgot the incident in a few days, but I never have. I still remember her kindness nearly 65 years later. She gave me my first English lesson. On the train, I watched as the scenery went from lush greens to dramatic reds to dry desert browns. We crossed the Continental Divide and the Mojave Desert. I thought about this new country that would be my home now. The future lay before me in a way that only a brief time before I could have thought impossible. I wasn't scared at all, even though I didn't know the language nor have a clue what I would do. I was just excited. For the first time in many years, I could daydream about the future. I knew I would learn English. I would get a job. Someday I would marry and have a family. I might even live to be an old man. Anything could happen. As the train pulled into Union Station in Los Angeles, my mother, father, and I gathered our belongings and readied to leave. I picked up my fedora and started to put it on, but then I reconsidered. I tossed the hat back on the luggage rack and turned to leave. That hat was a part of my previous life, the life I intended to leave behind. I stepped off the train and into the California sun. I was 19 years old, and my real life was just beginning. So that is the end of the book. But I've got epilogue to read tomorrow. So if you guys can tune in tomorrow, the epilogue will tell you kind of about his life in America and the things that he had gone through once he was in America. So yeah, or cake for an appetizer. That's funny, Lucas. Exactly. So he ends up in Los Angeles, California. Tomorrow's chapter will kind of tell you about the rest of his life, how he lived out the rest of his life. This book to me is very similar. Sorry, I'm laughing at Noah. Similar to the book we read at the very beginning of the year. Kind of ironic how that works. Like the first book that we read, Long Walk to Water, the last book that we read at the end of the year. Storylines, even though they went through different situations and different things in their lives, that they kind of experience, I guess, different things, but similar things, I guess. I don't know. So tomorrow at 1:00, I will read the epilogue. The other thing is today is my mom's birthday. Don't say goodbye yet, Lucas. Today's my mom's birthday. So you guys all have to type in happy birthday to my mom. So, and you can even sing happy birthday to her at your house if you want right now. I guess I'll sing to her. Are you ready? Can everyone sing with me? Are you ready? I'll wait for a second to get a yes. Marin, I know you'll sing with me. I don't know about Lucas. He might not sing with me. All right. Are you ready? Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear mom. Happy birthday to you. Oh my gosh, I did it live, Mom, on the internet. Aw, thanks, Noah. Thanks, Lucas. All right. Well, I hope you guys have a great day. Try to stay a little warm. What a difference. Yesterday was so beautiful. I spent most of my time outside yesterday. And then today is bleh. It's cold. But I hope you guys have a great day. Look, my mom said thank you. I hope you guys have a great day, and I will see you guys tomorrow. I love you guys. Have a good afternoon.